So, what does the evidence tell us about what to do to be more effective advocates? Everything points to the impact of relationships that have certain qualities in common, as we are going to see in video 3. We are influenced not so much by strangers with slick sound bites, but by people with whom we have existing relationships. We're going to look at Malcolm Gladwell's The Tipping Point for some clues about people who exercise influence way out of proportion to their numbers. We're also going to see, through studies of factors driving library support, that successful libraries are conspicuously involved with communities. They are deeply embedded in the community's processes and task groups, and they're opportunistic about ways of demonstrating value. They do not leave key relationships to chance or key understandings to chance. One source of useful information, though not a product of scholarly research, is the work of journalist Malcolm Gladwell. Gladwell's ideas and methods have encountered some pushback, but I think some of the observations in his book, The Tipping Point, have high relevance for advocates. He describes 3 types of extraordinarily connected and influential people. He calls them connectors, mavens, and salesmen. Each one of these types influences an exceptionally high number of other people, and that is why advocates need to know them. His first category, he calls them connectors. They know and are in regular communication with a lot more people than most of us. In fact, connectors have at least 150 people in their network with whom they are in real personal contact. Do you know any of these connectors? One's chance of becoming a connector, of course, increase with age and experience. Every community has its visible connectors. How can we engage them in our advocacy for libraries? Do they know what they need to know to advance the cause out there? Mavens are people Gladwell describes as knowing a great deal. And furthermore, they are eager to share their expertise to help other people. Who are the mavens within library land? Who are the mavens outside our ranks who could be important to the advocacy for libraries? And how could their engagement with us be strengthened? I think of author Cory Doctorow and copyright experts Lawrence Lessig and Michael Geis. These are people who fit Gladwell's definitions perfectly. They've become engaged in library-related issues. And perhaps we can think of some high-profile journalists who are regarded as experts in their specialties. Gladwell calls salesmen people who are enthusiastic, promotional, and negotiating people. They influence a large number of people. I think of Professor David Lankus, who is author of the Atlas of New Librarianship within our own ranks. Again, who are the salespeople out there who can be the most persuasive for libraries? These 3 types of people are the agents of change who impart critical mass to movements. Gladwell calls this the law of the few. One obvious lesson for library advocates is to identify the people who can move the cause forward and develop relationships with them, and provide them with the stories and the information to share. The second big lesson for advocates is also pretty clear. We need to not just engage connectors, mavens, and salesmen. We need to be connectors, mavens, and salesmen. When you observe successful library advocacy in communities, whether in public or academic or school or special libraries, you will see all these types of people in action, inside and outside the libraries themselves. Sadly, the OCLC 2008 study From Awareness to Funding found that politicians and community leaders tended not to see passionate librarians engaged in community leadership around them. Why not? Do you have that kind of leadership potential? Well, of course you do. You're not powerless and you do care about it. You can read a capsule summary of Gladwell's ideas on his website, but I would highly recommend a reading of the whole book, The Tipping Point. Let's look at factors driving library support. What factors are the ones that are the big drivers? There are some striking conclusions and a few surprises in the scholarly literature that's noted by Ken Haycock in his comprehensive review of that literature presented as the Follett Lecture, which is on your reading list. In a 2003 study about public library funding in the US, Bryce Allen floated the hypothesis that increased demand for public library service would be associated with increased funding, and that positive public opinion on the quality of the service of libraries would be correlated with increased per capita funding over time. Wrong on both counts. We have seen this message before. These factors, based on his study, were not in themselves drivers of increases. This confirms what many public librarians know, that political decisions about public library funding take place in a very complex environment and in an environment of contention where many good causes compete. In fact, a higher public demand for service might actually occasion greater demand for efficiencies rather than higher funding to manage the situation. This is a cautionary message to advocates not to rely on numbers or outputs to carry their case for support. A few years later, McClure, Feldman, and Ryan in 2007 wrote a paper that, quote, identifies the factors that are critical to a public library's success in advocacy, community support, government relations, and ultimately the perceived importance of the library in the community, end of quote. The authors looked at factors influencing political support, including the working of the local political system. They acknowledged that the decision-making environment of each community is unique, and so are the personalities of the people involved. They note that the management of the successfully networked library is not leaving any of these relationships to chance. They found that libraries that are successful in getting support have 5 characteristics in common. First, they are proactive. In other words, they do not wait to be invited to the table. Second, they're led by directors who are active in the community as well as the library. Third, they are opportunistic. That is, they're able to recognize a chance to go for it, even when the opportunity doesn't appear to have the library in mind. Fourth, they are prepared. That is, they are better prepared than other organizations when they've got that chance to make their relevance known and to get money to do their work. And fifth, they have the relationships in place. Quote, year-round positive relationships with elected and appointed officials and government agency and nonprofit leaders, as well as community opinion makers, unquote. These managers are not, quote, meeting strangers when they go to the annual library budget hearing. These librarians are front and center in the vision of the community and its leaders, and they are known to know what they are talking about. I'll add here that based on my own experience and that of many colleagues, this work of positioning the library is often unseen by many frontline staff who wonder where their leader is. Some of this intensive relationship development work is seen as some form of schmoozing that's a substitute for real work. Nothing could be further from the truth, and all the evidence supports this relationship development. Exactly the same could be said for library leaders in academia and schools and companies. McClure and his co-authors suggest doing a political audit as a foundation for an advocacy plan. They cite the Cuyahoga County Public Library as a worked example of this strategic approach to advocacy, applying those 5 factors that I mentioned a moment ago with specific examples of them. Now, you could do this with any type of library in any setting. All of this material about Cuyahoga County Public Library is actually quite consistent with research on influence. This is echoed in a doctoral thesis by Elizabeth Hubbard in 1996 on the funding of the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh in 3 different decades. Hubbard examined factors influencing funding. One of the findings is that the values and views of colleagues amongst the decision makers were significant drivers. The funding of the library just didn't make their priority list. And these decision makers tended not to disagree with one another in their consistency with their values, with the result that the funding situation of the library was one of what Hubbard called benign neglect. Joanne Marshall of the University of North Carolina has frequently explored the value of special libraries, particularly medical libraries, in her research. The study called The Value of Library and Information Services in Patient Care, issued in 2013, is her most recent. The aim of this research was to identify the differences that the service made to the healthcare professionals who were working with patients. As Professor Marshall explains in the video interview this week, to be effective in advocating, you have to address the issues that people tell you are important for decision making. In studying health library services, it's critical to have evidence of the library's impact on patient care and to be able to relate it to the priorities of decision makers. That study showed that library services had a clear impact on the work of the healthcare professionals, leading to better decisions, advice to patients, and also saving time, all aspects that mattered a great deal to hospital administrators. In a study of academic libraries, Beverly Lynch and colleagues asked senior administrators about their library. It was clear from the university administrators' answers that the academic library is in a new and much more competitive environment in which behavior counts. One provost commented, quote, that the head of the library is present at a lot of significant conversations because she is charismatic, visionary, energetic, smart, and engaging. I don't think it is organizationally determined, unquote. It was also clear that the library leaders needed to position themselves as effective team members in senior decision-making bodies in the university. So, in summary, what have we learned? Well, from Gladwell, that a small number of people exercise influence well beyond their numbers. From Allen, that increased demand for public library service and very high regard does not lead to increased funding. From Hubbard, that decision makers tend to follow the views and values of colleagues. From McClure and Lynch and colleagues, that library management must be proactive in the community, opportunistic, prepared, and have established relationships with decision makers and those who influence decision makers. And for Marshall, having evidence of impacts that are aligned with the priorities of decision makers in the organization is critically important. In our next video, we're going to look at Robert Cialdini's Universal Principles of Influence.